Let's take a look at arrow functions in Lexical This from ES6. An arrow function expression has a shorter syntax than a function expression and does not have its own this, arguments, super, or new.target. These function expressions are best suited for non-method functions, and they cannot be used as constructors. Let's take a look at what this looks like in code. The first example I'm going to show you is I'm going to take a traditional function expression and convert it to an arrow function so that you can see how they look. We're going to write a function that prints something when you pass it something. This function will take in one parameter, thing to print, and it will console.log the thing to print. If we run this code, we'll see that node arrow function.js, when I run it, prints purple. An arrow function looks very similar to this. I'm going to copy paste the functions from line 2 through 4, and I'm going to change it to be an arrow function. I'm going to call it print a thing so that I have unique function names. And then how I convert a traditional function expression to an arrow function expression is I get rid of the function keyword and I add an arrow before the opening brace. So now this is an arrow function that's held in the constant variable called print a thing. That variable holds the entire function expression that takes in one parameter called thing to print, and then inside of the function it prints the thing. We can run this code by passing in something to print, and we should see that it prints just like the traditional function expression above it. In the second example, we're going to take a look at what an arrow function looks like when it has more than one parameter. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out the entire first example so that I don't see it printed below. In this example, we want to see what it looks like when you have an arrow function that takes in two numbers, it adds those two numbers together, and then it returns the sum. This is called add two numbers. It's an arrow function that takes in first number and second number, and then it returns first number plus second number. To use this function, I'm going to capture this in a constant variable called sum, and this is going to call add two numbers, and we're going to pass in 10 and 44. If I console.log sum, I should see that sum is equal to 54. And it is. For the next example, let's take a look at what an arrow function looks like when it has no parameters. So the first thing I want to do is I want to comment out example 2 so that I don't see it printed below. In this example, what I want to do is I just want to print the word blue. So this is an arrow function that takes in no parameters, and then inside it prints blue. For the next example, I'm going to show you some of the weird things that can hang people up with arrow functions. The first thing I want to show you, so that you're armed with the knowledge the first time you see it in code, is that if your arrow function only has one argument, you do not have to wrap that argument with parentheses. It looks like this. Const print the thing takes in one parameter, that is thing to print. And then inside of this arrow function, I'm going to console.log the thing to print. But as I said, because this arrow function only has one parameter, I do not have to have parentheses, so I can remove these. And if I run this code, we'll see that it works just fine with no parentheses. Again, this arrow function only has one parameter, so I do not have to wrap that one parameter with parentheses like this. I can get by, if I choose to, with no parentheses around this parameter. The next example that I want to demonstrate is to show you that if you have an arrow function with one line of logic with a return statement, you have the option to write what's called a one-line arrow function. Let's take a look at what that would look like in code. I'm going to write a function that adds 10 to a number and returns it. Equals. This arrow function takes in one number, input number, and it returns input number plus 10. Const number plus 10 equals add 10, and I'm going to pass in 22 for this example, and then I want to print that out. And I should get 32. 22 plus 10 equals 32. What would it look like to convert this arrow function into a single line arrow function since it qualifies? It qualifies because it has one return statement with one line of code. I'm going to copy the entire function so that you can see the before and after. So the very first thing I do is I remove the brackets because I'm going to write a single line function, so I no longer need the brackets. I'm going to back this statement all the way up to the same line, and because it's a single line arrow function, the return is actually implied, so I no longer need the return keyword. So line 40 is the exact same or the equivalent of lines 36 through 38. This is a constant variable called add 10, which holds a function which takes in one input number, one parameter, and then inside of the function it returns input number plus 10. The thing that can complicate this even more is because this is an arrow function, again, that only has one input number. Remember what we learned in the previous example, you no longer have to have parentheses around this parameter. This is technically the same thing. Constant variable called add 10, which has one input number and it returns input number plus 10. This is about as weird as arrow functions can get in my opinion. I prefer to write my arrow functions where the parameters always have parentheses around them for a visual clue for what's going on with your arrow function. But again, that's a personal preference. The last example I want to show you deals with lexical this and arrow functions, and it shows why it solves a common headache before ES6. Let's glance back to the documentation. If we remember, an arrow function does not have its own this. The this value of the enclosing execution context is used. This solves an important headache that occurred before ES6. Let's take a look at that headache. In this example, we're going to mock out a few things to try to illustrate the point. So I'm going to have a function called boy. Inside of here, what I want to do is I want him to have an age, and every second I want his age to increase. So here's how I would logically start to think through that problem. I would want to say age, or this dot age, is equal to 0. And then inside of here, I want to say set interval, which is a function that takes in two parameters. It takes in a function and it takes in how long to pause between each iteration or each interval. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to pass in a function that's called grow up. And then inside of here I want to say this.age plus equal 1. And I want this to happen every second. 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. Here's why there's a problem already with this code. Because I didn't use an arrow function, the this.age on line 50 is a huge problem. This.age does not exist between these two brackets. The way we can solve this before ES6 is you had to do some painful workarounds. So you would have to do something like this. You would have to say const that is equal to this, and I would say that.age, and I would say that.age down here. So now this can get access to this outside of this bracket. This seems like a workaround that we shouldn't have to have anymore, and thankfully ES6 solves it for us, right? So what we can do is, we no longer need this. What we can do is, we'll change this to girl. We no longer need to have this workaround. I can say this.age is equal to 0, and I can get to this.age inside of the set interval because I'm going to use an arrow function. So now when I click this.age, I can see that I get access to the same variable, which is nice. I no longer have the workaround that I had before. This code is substantially easier to read, in my opinion, than this code. And this shows why arrow functions dealing with lexical this are an important win from ES6.